All right. Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. I think we're going to get started. I want to respect your time tonight. I'm so glad you're all here with us. So tonight we have a very special presentation. It's called A Woven World, Making and Unmaking Our Histories Through Science and Art, featuring Alison Hawthorne Deming, who's here with me and whom I'll introduce more fully in a moment. So briefly, my name is Jessie Rack. I'm the program director at the Natural History Institute here in Parched, Arizona. So great to be here with you. I first wanted to say a couple of words about the Institute for those of you who are not familiar with our work. So the Natural History Institute is a mission-based, independent nonprofit organization based here in Parched, Arizona, in the Mogollon Highlands ecoregion, which we're currently working with our science team to spread the word of the scientific importance of this ecoregion in terms of biodiversity. So our mission is to provide leadership and resources for a revitalized practice of natural history that integrates art, sciences, and humanities to promote the health and well-being of humans and the rest of the natural world. So the gist of that is that the Institute tries to use different lenses of art, science, humanities, whatever we can to help people fall in love with nature. So whatever we can. And so I thought Alison tied in very well with this mission. So quickly, I wanted to bring your attention to a couple of resources that the Natural History Institute has to offer. One is our website, that's naturalhistoryinstitute.org, which has all sorts of resources, including information about upcoming programs. A few I wanted to briefly mention, and these are all available. They'll be live streamed and available on our YouTube channel. So February 24th, we have a documentary screening of Parched, the Art of Water in the Southwest. And so this is one of the ways that we're using art to get to these kind of natural history ideas. So we'll be live streaming that on February 24th, and it'll be available later. Newly announced on Friday, March 4th, we have Gary Nabhan, who will be talking about the nature of three deserts, the Sonoran and Arabian and the desert within. I'm pretty excited about that one. This will also be live streamed. And we'll have another webinar in this series, which is called Stories of Culture and Place, Nature and Culture. And that features Mary Power. That'll be on March 31st. So I mentioned a great resource is NHI's YouTube channel, which we encourage you to subscribe to, which has a series of short educational videos that our staff puts together called Notes from the Field, as well as recordings of many different programs. This one will be there after. Well, it's there right now, but we'll edit it and it'll be up there forever. It'll be on there in its edited form around this time tomorrow if you're interested in sharing it widely. I also wanted to say, if you're interested and so inclined as to consider supporting our work, like all small nonprofits, this is a labor of love and your support is so important and necessary to our continued work. If you're interested, on the homepage of the website, you can donate there. You'll figure that out. It's naturalhistoryinstitute.org. And I wanted to say welcome to the Natural History Institute community. I'm so glad all of you are here today. So a couple of things about the logistics of the Zoom program in terms of kind of Zoom protocols. As I've been mentioning, a lot of people have been saying hello through the chat function and sharing where you're from. Just to let you know, we'll be turning that off momentarily just because we found it's a little bit distracting if people are chatting back and forth during a program. But in its place, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is also at the bottom of your screen. If you look down on the bottom right, there's a little icon that looks like cartoon speech bubbles. And that will be on for the whole program. So if at any time you have a question for Alison or a comment, I'll save the last 10 minutes or so of this presentation to come back and visit those questions and ask them to Alison, and we'll discuss them. Also, if you see something that someone's asked or made a comment that's along the lines of what you were going to say, there's a little thumbs up icon there, and so you can upvote those questions. So that'll kind of high grade them, and we'll be able to see if a lot of the same people want to ask the same questions. So as I mentioned, this program will be available, the recording of this program will be available tomorrow on the Natural History Institute YouTube channel, if you'd like to share and direct other people to this discussion. So with that, I'm going to quickly turn off the chat, but the Q&A function remains open. Okay, And now it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce our guest here tonight, Alison Hawthorne Deming. So quickly, if I can share her bio a little bit. Alison is Regents Professor at the University of Arizona, where she founded the Field Studies and Writing program in 2015. She has an MFA from Vermont College and has been the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Stegner Fellowship, 2 poetry fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, and a Walt Whitman Award, among multiple other fellowships, residencies, prizes. There is a whole page that I just condensed. I'm sorry, Alison, I cut out important things. And so tonight, part of our discussion is going to be about her newest book called A Woven World on Fashion Fishermen, the Sardine Dress, which was released in August 2021, available at your local independent bookseller. And so we're going to talk some about this. And also, I love, one of the things I love about Alison is that one of her most keen interests is at the intersection of art and science, which, if I can share a very quick anecdote, we actually met, did we figure out what year that was? 2013 or 14? I should have remembered this.
Something like that. Yeah.
Something like that. So we actually met years ago when I was in graduate school at the University of Connecticut, and Alison came and gave a talk, and I went to the graduate student lunch and met her, and remember asking some question like, how do I grow up to be a science communicator? How do I combine my interests in science and writing? How do I do that? And I don't remember what she said, but now I'm the program director of the National History Institute. So thank you. Thank you, Alison. Really appreciate that.
I guess it was a drop in the bucket. I mean, you made a lot of good choices along the way.
I don't know. I mean, you can totally take credit if you want to.
Thank you.
Well, congratulations on this wonderful book, Alison. And I just thought we'd start it off by maybe inviting you to speak about, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, this book's really interesting because it pulls together kind of a personal history, Alison's own kind of family history, as well as a history of makers and herring fishermen and dresses and fashion. And so I'd love to hear kind of, how did this book come about? How did you think to combine all of the different pieces of this, all the threads, if you will?
Thanks. Thanks. It's great to be here with you and great to see some old friends and some new friends. Really happy that we could be together here for this. Well, yes, it is a rather implausible idea, isn't it? Fashion and fishermen and family. In part, as a writer, one wants to take on an interesting challenge and see if you can pull it off. But I've carried this feeling around that I know many of us feel, which is this: we're in a time of this radical unmaking of everything, the unmaking of the natural world, the unmaking of democracy, the unmaking of a sense of a future as a kind of condition in which we would want to live and want our children and grandchildren to live. So there's this radical unmaking going on all around us. It's very destabilizing. And I began to think about my matrilineal line. My grandmother and great-grandmother, they were makers. They were dressmakers, first in Paris, then in New York. They were accomplished women who were making high fashion dresses during the Gilded Age. And there's no record of their businesses. There's no record of what they did because they were women, and many women's businesses were invisible and didn't matter in history. They were makers. And who cares about the makers, unless they're celebrities. And this grandmother had lived with us during my childhood, and I discovered that she, in fact, was buried in an unmarked grave. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, this woman's story needs to be told as much as I can tell it as a celebration of making. So it started out, well, we're just going to write about my matrilineal line. And I was telling my friend Barbara Hurd, some of you know her, a wonderful environmental writer, lyrical writer. She came to visit me up in my summer place in the Bay of Fundy, and we were walking among some abandoned smokehouses where the islanders used to smoke herring, very profitable industry on the island. And she said, well, what are you working on? I said, I'm looking into the blah, blah, blah. And then she said, oh, tell me about these fish houses. And of course, I went on and on because I've been going to this island since I was a child. And she said, you need to write about this. This is so interesting. And you know so much about it. I said, no, I have to write about these women. And she said to me, this was the dare. She said to me, it's the same story, Alison. It's working in resistance to the unmaking, the decline of the fisheries in the North Atlantic, the decline of the beautiful craft of building herring wares. There's an example of one here on my background. This was another place where I felt the unmaking of treasured ways of life that involved great craft and intelligence and reading the environment. So I thought, sure, dressmakers and fishermen. And that's kind of how it happened. And I will say, you know, as we were planning this event, Jessie, and you asked me about it, I remember saying to you, and I think this is important to bring up, is that I did not want to write about nature anymore unless I was also writing about culture, because we have such a task in weaving ourselves together in meaningful and engaged and nurturing ways with the natural world. And we have such a portrait, well detailed, of our culture as being so destructive. So, you know, it was a fun and interesting and strange challenge to take on, to create a braid in which I could bring these worlds together in the book.
Yeah.
And weave them as warp and weft, so to speak.
I remember you saying that, and that does speak so much to the kind of the mission of the Natural History Institute. Just how do we, as humans, see ourselves again as part of nature? Because if we see ourselves as something separate, then what are we doing? You know, we're ruining it because we're not seeing that everything affects us.
Yeah.
So, and there's a part actually. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, for many of us as urban people, nature has become very abstracted. But in a place like this island, which is Grand Manan Island, where they built these herring wares, nature and culture are still utterly woven. The fate of the island, economically and socially, is entirely dependent on the marine resources. They've been dependent upon the sea and their fishing prowess for 200 years. And as that ecosystem is challenged, you see that shifting of culture. And so I have been so fascinated with this place because it's a wonderful opportunity to really look at a place where nature and culture are obviously interwoven. Of course, they are everywhere, but sometimes we don't see it.
Yeah. So you partially grew up on Grand Manan Island. Is that how I say it? Do I say it right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So were you always interested in herring and in fisheries? Was that kind of, did that go, or when did this start? Were you like a child into it?
We first went there, I believe, in 1956. I grew up in Connecticut, and my parents wanted an out of the way place and not a, touristy place. And they saw an article in a magazine about Grand Manan Island, and we went up there. And the fishermen were very friendly. They weren't used to being overrun by tourists, and they weren't recreational fishers; they were commercial fishers, these herring wares and other fisheries. And so they took us out on the boats. And I still have the photograph that I took with my Brownie Hawkeye camera the first time I went out with fishermen to see the seining of a herring ware, with my little 9-year-old fingers clicking this picture of all those fish rising up as this beautiful image of the abundance of the sea. And so, yeah, I fell in love with herring when I was 9 years old. And particularly with this method of catching herring, which, is beautiful and smart and could be a sustainable fishery.
Yeah.
Like taking a huge boat out and dragging the bottom of the sea and taking everything, within miles.
Yeah. I loved how you kind of use the herring story and the story of the weirs and the makers as just a way to kind of contrast what was happening with the unmaking. You say in the introduction, how far can the unmaking go before the making becomes impossible? So it's all these fishermen trying to still hold on to this craft. And meanwhile, inevitable climate change and everything's happening, and the fishes, ranges are changing. And I really liked how you framed that as like making and unmaking, craft versus history. So.
Thanks. Yeah. There's a historic map of the island, and made in the 1930s by a historian, that shows there were almost 100 of these herring wares all around the island, just 20 miles long, 10 miles wide. It's not huge, but there were wares absolutely everywhere, and a vibrant smoking industry for smoking herring and packing them and sending them to places that did not have refrigeration. So this was called the sardine capital of the world, for the way they made smoked herrings. And now there are, most years, 9 or 10 of these herring wares. We don't make smoked fish anymore because there are sardines that are made and put in cans, and the regulations over a sort of artisanal method of curing and smoking fish became so legislated that the small-time fishers just couldn't do it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So it is an art, I think. I mean, I know there are some of the participants here I know are artists. And I mean, when I look at this, which is simply to catch herring, to me, it looks like art, similar to land art, sea art. It's beautiful. Mm-hmm. And every one of them is beautiful. It has a slightly different shape. So to see this kind of craft go out of the world, largely because of capitalistic impulses that have come in, and the marketing being taken over by big multinational corporations, etc. It's a terribly sad additional example of the unmaking, and I did not want this to be forgotten, and I wanted to honor it and honor the fisher people who are still doing it, in hopes they'd feel some shred of encouragement from being seen and recognized.
Yeah. And in parallel, your book really dives deeply into kind of your personal history of how your grandmother was a dressmaker, and it's the same story, right? Of just like fast fashion has kind of taken over this part of being a dressmaker. And I loved how you kept describing in multiple places, she didn't need to measure, she just could eyeball and like make the correct dimensions for women. And you yourself are making a dress in one of the chapters, and
my prom dress.
Prom dress. Yeah. So it's just this interesting parallel of how, makers, whether they be women, so much of this book is about the women makers, but also the craft is disappearing, and history is forgetting about it and moving on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing about human beings, that we have so many skills and can make so many things. Some of the things we make have terrible unforeseen consequences associated with them. So I don't want to say, hey, just go out and make. But there is a lot to celebrate in our inventiveness, our craftiness, when the craft or the art is so perfectly fit to its time and place, as I think both these dressmakers were, and the fishers. And my grandmother was, so these were, if you imagine the dresses, well, if you're watching the Gilded Age, those dresses aren't nearly as fancy as the stuff I saw in fashion magazines from that period. So those were the kinds of dresses, and I think that show is terrible, by the way, but never mind. That's another story. But, they were making fabulously elaborate dresses in a small shop, 12 or 14 women working for them, somebody who specialized in beads, somebody who specialized in sleeves, and they were making these, they were creating the theater of the aristocracy of that time. And if you look at all these times in history when there are this elaborate fashion statement coming from those with money and power, and that includes the church as well, the Catholic Church in particular, throughout a lot of history. You see that we see the elaborate costumes. We often see the poor. We see the women working in the sweatshops in desperate conditions. There's a whole kind of maker class that we haven't documented well enough. They're somewhere in the middle. Maybe they're an origin of a middle class, but they are creating, and they have the aesthetics and they have the skill to create magnificent objects that then go off in service of power and wealth and whatever. But I'm interested in the makers themselves, because they're after something different. They're after taking pride in a skill that's learned over time, that has a meaning and beauty, and is close to the earth. And even in the fashion, I got really interested because when you start looking at fashion, I didn't ever think about fashion or think I'd write about it. But I thought if I wanted to know these women, I would have to think about fashion. But when you start looking at fashion through an environmentalist lens, you start thinking about all the fabrics, cotton, camel hair, wool made from camel's hair, sealskin coats, fur coats, silk made from fibers spun by a bug. Everything goes back to the earth, of course. And all of this elaborate costumery comes back to the most humble aspects of what we're able to do with the simplest products that come out of the earth.
I love that. And I liked how, so you choose as kind of a framing device to start the book by describing the sardine dress of the title, and you close it with a different dress. But the sardine dress in particular, I love that it, especially reflecting back after I finished the book, how it tied together the fisheries and the fashion and your history of your family being dressmakers. And I was wondering, was that kind of a post hoc thing that you went looking for a dress to use or did you find that and you were inspired to write about your grandmother, or how did that come about?
Well, I had the idea. I said, I'm going to do this, and I don't know how I'm going to ever yoke this stuff together. And then I read an article about a show at the Metropolitan Museum in New York that was about, high fashion, just wacky, wild, crazy fashion that represented this handmade kind of artistry. And many of the things were also made in conjunction with manufactured aspects of the dress. So it was kind of a meeting of the artisanal handcraft with the more industrial manufacture. And I saw in it, there was in the article I read about this sardine dress of Yves Saint Laurent. So bam-o, I went to New York and I saw that dress, and I was floored because it's this, well, you put the image up on your website, thank you, but this beautiful sheath that just clings to the body and all this embrocation of sequins. So it just looks like fish scales. So it's a woman has been transformed into some kind of biomorphic miracle that is very much like a herring in all of its beauty and oceanic coloring. And so it gave me enormous confidence to say, okay, I'm gonna put this sardine dress really early on, because I'm not the first person in the world who's put together a dress and a sardine. And if Yves Saint Laurent can make something of it, I think it will help me and inspire me. And then, of course, that writing about that dress took me to all kinds of other places, about women's bodies and all the artifice of female sexuality. That dress was inspired by the film Gilda. There's no sardine dress in the film Gilda. There's just a very sexy, sexy dance by Rita Hayworth.
I went and watched it after reading about it. Yeah. It was amazing.
Yeah. Well, if folks are interested in reading that essay, you can get the book. It's also up on LitHub, which published it. But it took me on a wonderful journey thinking about, creating an artifice of beauty and sexuality on a female body. Rita Hayworth here, she's doing this sort of fake striptease, and she's supposed to be just the most desirable woman in the world. When you read about her in that film, you find out that she had just had a baby. The designer who made her dress put a big fake bow on her belly to cover the fact that she still had her, maternal belly from delivering her child. And she was all trussed up like a horse under the dress, keep everything in place and not popping out. So, it was a really fascinating way to start my inquiry, digging a little deeper into fashion than just the marketing side of it. But what does it teach us about how women are created as certain representations of certain aspects of our humanity, usually the erotic ones for a lot of our lives.
Yeah. And I noticed too, so many of these stories of fashion and also of makers, of particularly the dressmakers and crafts women mostly in this book, are so many of them have to do with women, like their survival, their erasure, their empowerment, their expression through their bodies. Was this a theme you started with, or did you just kind of happen upon it in your research? And I think it parallels too how you say, or how you said earlier, history doesn't remember the makers. Is this because they were women? Is this, yeah.
That's certainly a big piece of it. Women's lives have not been as well documented. There are certain periods of my probably great grandmother's life. Woman didn't even have her own passport. She would just be put on her husband's passport. So women didn't really count. The documentation of their lives, sometimes women's businesses, I was told, were not recorded as businesses because they were done at home. So both Marie and Louisa, these two women, ran the business out of their home. They would rent a big brownstone and they would live on one floor, and they would have the shop on the lower floor, and they would have the parlor, which was their parlor, but was also the place where the customers could come to have a fitting. And, they didn't have to see the shop below. They could come to have a fitting and all of that. And so now I've forgotten what your question was. Oh, it was about the empowerment of women. And I thought, yeah, right. Well, I never realized how capable and accomplished my grandmother was. Even though she lived with me throughout my whole childhood, she was just an old woman in the house. She was fascinating. She listened to the opera. She read the New York Times every day. I mean, she was a fascinating kind of cosmopolitan woman. But, there were 100 questions I should have asked her, and I never did. I knew she'd had a dress salon in New York City. Why did I never ask her these questions? And so in trying to address who was this woman, I came to realize that a woman that I had reduced to just the old woman in the house, who might make me a crepe Suzette if I was really nice, actually was an artist, an entrepreneur, somebody who knew how to run a business, to hire and fire and rent a building where she could rent out rooms above so that she could get a nice enough building that the fancy customers would show up. I mean, she was a very savvy, accomplished, aesthetically sophisticated woman. And I did not even see that. And I thought, how many women, if my own grandmother is invisible to me, how many women's stories have we shortchanged and have we not examined? And if I could at least start with my grandmother and great grandmother, maybe that shows the way for others to ask some questions of the elder women in their lives before it's too late and they're gone and the questions can't be asked.
Yeah. Oh, it's true. And I think that's so much. It made me think about, what did I not know about my grandparents before they passed? Like, what are the stories I missed just out of kind of the nearsightedness of being a child and not thinking about it?
Exactly.
Yeah, I actually spoke with someone, I think she's here tonight, Maria, was into the Institute last week, and she was looking forward to this and started reading your book, and her grandmother also is a dressmaker. And wow. I think, Maria, you can tell me in the Q&A maybe if I'm wrong. I think she was Italian though, but I thought it was fascinating, just the parallel. And so she was very drawn to your story, and maybe she'll ask a question or share some more about that in a bit. But already I think your book is kind of leading folks to that inquiry and thinking more deeply about their own histories.
And so, every woman, I mean, even the aristocratic women, when you read all those great 19th century novels, Edith Wharton and whatever, they have their work on their laps all the time. When all the fancy women are sitting in the parlor having tea or sherry, they have their work in their laps. What's their work? It's the fixing the button, it's the little crochet, it's the little bit of embroidery. They're not making the fancy ball gowns, but women always had their work. And of course, that's something we've lost. Now women always have their cell phones, and me among them. But it's extremely interesting to me that was always referred to as their work. And how far back that goes, I don't know. But I kind of love it as I've come to think about the importance of that little bit of handcraft, that little bit of agency that women, all kinds of economic strata practiced in some form or other.
Yeah. Yeah. And are you a maker still? I know you made your prom dress. Have you made other things?
I made, I used to sew a lot. I mean, when
Yeah.
I was quite good, I made a prom dress. I made a suit, a skirt and jacket, tailored, fitted,
gosh.
beautiful jacket, which I wish I still had. And I made clothes for my daughter. I made quilts for my daughter when she was growing up.
Yeah.
But I don't sew anymore. If I could get a really good working treadle Singer sewing machine, I might take up sewing again, but I hate the complicated computer. Here you got 7 million choices. I don't like the contemporary sewing machines. And my life is filled with other kinds of making, but most of my making goes into writing. I see this as a maker way, and certainly gardening and cooking and those kinds of things. But I'm not a crafter. But
yeah, but why should making be limited to crafting, right? So you make books very well. So I think that's an art of creation. It's creativity in action, right? So
right.
These are all the things that are kind of, it's like an act of love, an act of like putting yourself into something. I think that
Yeah.
we can make a new definition for it.
And the love of form, the love of shaping things, the love of, starting with just strings of yarn and coming out with a magnificent sweater. It's not dissimilar to starting out with a pile of words and coming out with an essay or a poem, but that there's a great pleasure in bringing things into form, bringing chaos into order through making objects, whether they're art objects or craft objects. Or gardens. Gardens can also be an expression of the aesthetic experience. And I know that these fishermen, they wouldn't use the same language I would, but I've been out with them when they're building these weirs and harvesting that fish, and they see beauty. They take great pride in the beauty of the things that they're making. And I think that's why they can't give up this craft of building these herring wares. It's not the big money fishery by any means.
Yeah.
But I've seen, and even the mending of the nets. Of course, the nets get all torn up every time you raise a seine up, and there's a lot of weight and force in that, and so the nets are constantly being repaired. And I remember seeing a older guy sitting in a skiff, tying together. They use a little shuttle, and then every little square, it's about a ½ inch square, has to be knotted at all four corners. So it's a very time-consuming process. I remember seeing an older guy sitting in this skiff mending it, and a younger guy was standing beside him, and just, and these are like working guys. These are not your poets, he was just staring at him, and he said, "How did you learn that?" And the guy named the person who had taught him, was probably his father or his uncle or something, because here's a lineage of men who are passing down a trade and a craft and a level of skill and a pride in making that, it's not a ball gown, but nonetheless, that feeling of your hands making the object that has meaning for your life and use for your life. You can see it in the men's faces, the pride and the meaning and the pleasure that they take in this work. And one cannot say that about all kinds of manual labor.
Yeah.
These, because traditional fisheries are, they're owner operated. So the community rises and falls depending on how well they manage the resource, as we say. And so the relationship with the sea is much more intimate and meaningful than if you're on a wage farming salmon. Doesn't matter if you do well or badly, you still get your so many bucks an hour.
Yeah.
It's a different relationship to work and a different relationship to the sea. This kind of traditional owner-operated fishery and corporate fishing, which is, it's taking over everything.
Yeah. And once again, I love how you've kind of tied the the art of being a maker with a connection to the natural world. And so whether it's through the materials that people were using to make their fashions and their fabrics, or, you know, understanding deeply the way the sea worked and the way the herring moved, right?
Mhm.
There's always this kind of deeper connection, and
Mhm.
something that's lost when you just go buy something at Target.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah. Which kind of leads me to start to broaden this conversation out a little bit, if that's all right with you. And we can circle back. I see some questions already at the end. We'll come back to these about the dressmaker and your grandmother. But something that was evident in this book in many places, something I've always valued about your body of work, is how you use poetry and language to communicate science in really accessible ways. And so it's particularly, I noticed it here with well, it was everywhere, but particularly with the herring and the talking about their life cycle. And it was clear how you were sharing so much scientific information in a really accessible way in a book about fashion. And so I'd love to hear, can you speak to that process and kind of, well,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm kind of a science groupie. I'm not trained as a scientist, but I'm absolutely fascinated by science, and I treasure this view of the world that involves, as in the early decades and centuries of natural history, that prizes observation in the field, long observation in the field. And I really treasure that. And I don't know, nothing is more interesting to me than the big story of life on Earth. Nothing is more interesting to me than that. And that story feels more urgent, more important, more necessary to understand now because of what's happening with climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the threats to all this planet has been able to produce thanks to our craziness. And so I need science to get anywhere close to that story. And yet, when I actually read scientific papers or scientific textbooks or go to a lecture by a scientist for a scientific audience, it's like, it's like, are you kidding me? Is there an idea here that I can take? Because I understand the constraints on professional discourse, and that they're necessary, and that science must test and verify, and things must be repeatable, and there must be data. And I respect that. But I want to know, well, if I took you out for a beer or a cup of tea, what could you tell me about what you think the condition of the herring are, what you think the condition of the Calanus finmarchicus, the prey that they require, what you think is the condition of the zooplankton and the future of them, and what you think about why this region is heating up faster than anywhere else on the globe in terms of the sea temperature in the North Atlantic. And if I can get a scientist to explain it to me over tea or a beer, I don't hear the language that's in a scientific paper, and I can understand it. Yeah. And so I'm always trying to do that. Even when I'm reading the science, I'm always trying to say, okay, how can I put this into a story? How can I put it into conversational language? How can I put it into poetic language? Because actually the findings of science are beautiful to me. I experience science and scientific discovery as an aesthetic experience. And it's an experience of the beauty of this amazing planet and its intricacy and interwovenness. And I can't take that emotion away when I learn these new things. And I think it's my job to make sure I don't take that emotion away. The scientist, at least in the professional publication, can't do that. Right. But I think one of the reasons we're seeing so much collaboration these days between art and science is because even the scientists think, I wouldn't be studying this aspect of the natural world. I wouldn't be studying marine science in the North Atlantic if I didn't love the world and love the fish and love the complexity and care about the future. So I think it's a kind of natural alliance for people in the arts, and poets and essayists in particular, to feed on the riches that science can offer, and particularly the biological sciences.
I love how you phrased that. Well, as I'm an ecologist by training, so kind of from the other side of the divide, I consider myself a poetry groupie. So
Great.
yeah, but same, you know, I know, and definitely like in my studies, I steered more towards learning how to communicate and learning how to not be so jargony. But it's so difficult because there's just those constraints of the academy in which you're like, oh, I must be accurate and I can't tell people how much I love what I'm doing, right? And so maybe we need to rely on the poets to let that out for us, but which is not to say that scientists shouldn't learn to communicate, because very much like it's so important that you learn to say what you're doing to normal people.
Yeah, and I think a lot of scientists are understand that and are experimenting with that. I mean, we have a program at the University of Arizona called the Rachel Carson Scholars, and it's a program in which graduate students across all disciplines can apply to become a Carson Scholar. And they're mostly people from the sciences, but some people from creative writing usually get in, usually one a year. And so they are there for a year across a number of disciplines. You know, you could have people from arid lands and people from ecology and evolutionary biology, and but all people are concerned about the fate of the natural world, and they spend the year learning science communication. How do you do the elevator speech? How do you write an op-ed? How do you tell me in 1 minute why I should care about your research? And this, you're not writing a paper. You can bring your feelings into telling me why your research matters. So they're learning those skills so that they're growing up as scientists, learning to speak to other scientists and other disciplines and people from humanities and the arts. And hopefully those skills will carry over as they go on into their professional lives.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if you've been siloed into professional discourse for 20, 30, 40 years, it's hard to learn new tricks. You can at any age, but I love the idea of many of these programs happening now that are helping students now in the sciences develop these skills early on. So it's just part of the program. Yeah, you have to know how to write a good professional paper, and you also need to know how to write an op-ed and how to tell your neighbors why they should care about the extinction of the desert fish.
It's always that balance between accurate and engaging when you're trying to do science communication. So if you're a young scientist watching this presentation, that's a great opportunity. I also recommend looking into the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. So they place all kinds of scientists at media outlets to learn how to be like science journalists. And so that's another good way to get experience doing this and walking that line of kind of accurate and engaging. Fantastic. Well, thank you for sharing that.
One of the resources, just quickly, it's the long-term ecological research site by the NSF. There are 24 of them, most of them in the US. And many of them now are also doing collaborative programs, bringing artists, scientists, composers, sculptors into their research sites, whether it's a forest or a desert or these are opportunities to experiment with conversations between the arts and the sciences in places where really cool science is being done. So it builds in that observational component, so long-term ecological research has now a component or a partner called long-term ecological reflections, and that's bringing the artistic, philosophic, thinking presence into the science to foster experiments and new forms of communicating.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of that. That's lovely. I know about the LTERs, but I didn't know about the second version. That's amazing. Well, thank you for sharing that. And so I love how you kind of shared the process of how poetry can speak for science and how it can share that love for the world. You kind of hinted at it, but I want to ask you, why is it so important that we get better at this as scientists and as poets and other kinds of writers? Why is it so important that we learn to do good science communication?
Well, we live in a nation that is not a science literate nation. It's extraordinarily dangerous. we're looking at the challenges we face of water scarcity, food scarcity, pandemics, and of course, climate change. We need a science literate culture. What's going on is terrifying. The demonization of science, the suppression of science, the censorship of science. This is very dangerous. It's not a game. And so every method we can think of to create a more science literate culture is helpful. It's as simple as that, I think.
Yeah. And I agree 1000%. And also I'll kind of add on that I think it's important too that we get, the science communication out to the communities that maybe are not science literate by choice, but maybe because we've not served them, we've not done a good job of educating all the communities, and we need every different person's voice in this. We need all these backgrounds and all of these experiences to help us solve these big problems that are going to affect everyone.
Yeah. And a part of that you're sort of hinting your way towards is how do we look at disadvantaged communities, and they may have suffered disproportionately from environmental contaminants. They have. I mean, there's plenty of documentation about that, and also from the threats of rising coastal waters. So I think one of the most important things that's happening in environmental literature and writing is this move towards trying to bring together our concerns for social justice with our concerns for protection of the planet and biodiversity, that these are not separate issues. This is one issue, and both sets of problems have to do with a kind of pathology of our culture, that it does more unmaking than it does making. And certainly the great economic disparities and the great disadvantage inflicted on communities of color is something it's been deeply embedded in our history, and we're struggling now to try to get better about it. So when we talk about having a science literate culture, it also has to be a social justice literate culture, so that it's not like when I first moved to the Southwest, I was all proud, I was working to protect the Ironwood National Monument, and a Latinx friend of mine, new friend of mine, said, "Yeah, who are you trying to protect it for? Not my family." Speaking about his relatives, trying to come up from Mexico, who had been working in the United States for decades, and then these inhumane policies came into place. And it was when I personally began to say, I have to think harder about when I'm working towards or thinking towards the protection of the planet. I cannot do that or advocate that as being at the expense of those who are being hurt the most by our choices here in the so-called first world.
Yeah, which is why, again, it's so important to hear all of these different narratives and all these different voices, and all the things that history's forgotten, all of the makers and all of the people who've been doing this the whole time and have been here.
People who work in nature are among the best observers of the natural world. That's why I love these fishers. You could say the same thing about people working in agriculture in this country. The enslaved Africans who worked on the cotton plantations. Would you love to know what they understood and learned about the natural world? There are texts we don't have that we should have in understanding this continent. And certainly the rise of Native American literatures is really, really great and important right now in helping us see the forward motion of Native American culture now, and bringing traditional ecological knowledge into conversation with our Western scientific views. There's just so many exciting things going on, asking us to think anew, think differently, write differently, in ways that would bring together concern for people with concern for the planet.
And I think that circles back to what you said at the beginning about how you don't want to write about nature without writing about people anymore, and about culture. It's all one thing.
Right.
It's all one story that weaves together.
Right.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Allison. I would like to turn now to some questions for our final 10 minutes. And if you haven't yet had a chance to put your question in the Q&A down here at the bottom, you're welcome to do that now. It's the little speech bubbles. And so I'll kind of go through, we've got a couple of upvoted ones. So the first question is from Mary, and she asked, what are some of the questions you wish you had asked your grandmother?
Oh, God. How did you learn the skills that you had? Who were some of your customers? And tell me some stories about your work with them. I would like to, she was known for, I was told, she was known for being able to disguise deformities in a woman's body. So she had clientele, she had a woman who had a hump back. I don't know what the proper terminology is for it. Or a woman who had a disfiguring surgery, right? She could create costumes and dresses that had, flourishes that would disguise those or turn them into assets. And I would love to hear how she thought about that, how she figured that out, I mean, there are just so many questions. How did her mother come from Paris to New York to end up in New York? And how was she ever able to establish a business during that time when it was all sweatshops? I think she must have been, the great grandmother must have been very, very savvy and very confident, if not arrogant, to know that she was not going to be in a sweatshop or run a sweatshop. But I mean, those are just a few of the so many questions. I'm just never asked her anything about her business.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for answering that. Maria has to run, but she did put her story. I'm going to mention it in here. Thank you so much, Maria. I'm sorry I got your story wrong. So she did put it in the questions. I'll just read it to you because she came in and shared it, and she emailed me and shared it with me that her grandmother's family was involved in the garment industry, but at the other end of the spectrum. So she was in Galveston. They made their way up to Brooklyn, and her family did piecework, and her grandmother was a runner. So she brought the finished garment to the next person. So they might have finished the buttonholes, and the next group sewed on the buttons. Yeah. And so she was from, I think she was Italian, and she learned Yiddish, and her Yiddish eventually became much better than her Italian. So Maria shared that with me. Just your book made her kind of think of all this and think of all the different ways that women played a role in the fashion industry, and all the different ways that, those stories are gone and forgotten.
Well, they suffered, those women who worked in those piecework. You can go to the Tenement Museum in New York, and you can go into one of those tenement buildings to see what life was like, where they were given the piecework. And they had these tiny little hand sewing machines, and they'd get a stack of like a bodice piece with a sleeve, and they'd just get a huge stack of these, and then they'd sew them all together. Then they'd be going on to the next house, and there would be maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people working in this tiny little room, stitching these things together, dust and fabric parts into their chests. They suffered all kinds of health ailments from it. I mean, the conditions of the sweatshops and the piecework in the 19th century in New York were horrific and shameful. And anyone who survived that is, to be celebrated.
Yeah. So a couple more questions here. Carol K. Condit asked, in crafting this book, it seems you have a newfound respect for your grandmother. Have you now placed a tombstone on her previously unmarked grave?
I have not yet, and I am wrestling with that. And I don't know what to do about it. I may. I think that this book is the tombstone. Right now, this is the tombstone. Because I know why she's in an unmarked grave. That's because my mother disliked her and had a very dysfunctional relationship with her. But what's interesting is in the same area, her sister and her second husband are both buried, and neither of them have gravestones either. And I don't know why that is. Is it money? Is it a choice? Is it their wish? I know in the case of my grandmother, it was a shunning and an emotional slight. And I feel like I should put a stone, but these are hard decisions, and maybe I will, but I haven't decided yet.
I like the idea of this being the stone. I think that's beautiful. I think you've done so much in sharing your grandmother's story with all of us, with everyone who reads this. Like, if that isn't a memorial, like, I don't know what is.
Thanks.
So, Augusta asks, do you use arts-based research? I don't think I know what that is.
Do I use arts-based research?
Arts-based research. Yeah.
Well, I visit a lot of museums. I do a lot, if that's what you mean. I do that. And also with this a study of fashion, I looked at a lot of historic images of fashion, artistic renderings of fashion, and contemporary. The last chapter deals with a contemporary exhibition in I think it was in Santa Fe. So if that's what you mean, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, here, it's a field of qualitative research. Thanks for clarifying, Augusta. Thinking about this conversation, artists bring forward questions that often make conversation complex. Speaking of bringing forward different ways of knowing, artists and science, there's, I'm going to mess that up. Micmac Elder Merdena and Albert Marshall's two-eyed seeing, a guiding principle of holding both Indigenous and Western. Yeah, this speaks to the importance of hearing different ways of knowing. Can you speak to this?
Yeah. I love this. The two-eyed seeing and Robin Wall Kimmerer's work with braiding sweetgrass. I mean, I think it's very much in our conversations that we still have a lot to learn and can learn a lot from the indigenous peoples of Canada and the United States and Mexico and other places as well. So there are Western science is good for a lot of things, but it's not good for other things. And it's not good for seeing the natural world as being sacred. And when it's sacred, as it is in the eyes of indigenous people, it's not something that you violate. It's one's science is local, and it's based on long duration of observation and place. And those are skills that we haven't honored sufficiently. And I think, much of this now, the voices that we're bringing in from traditional ecological knowledge are going to help us.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Thank you. Thanks for that question. We have time. We're going to hit this last question because I think it's a fascinating one from Rita, who asks, have you encountered any areas where folks are creating fiber sheds where they only wear clothes made from materials raised within a 100-mile radius? And can you address the idea of fiber sheds, clothing oneself only within a fiber shed, just a watershed, etc.? I love those.
Hi, Rita. Is that Rita Cantu?
Yeah.
I bet you could answer that question. I don't have an answer to it, but man, that's a hard one. It's hard enough to try to think of doing that with your food, but as a fiber shed project, that would be fascinating. I don't have an answer for you other than no.
I love that. Thank you so much. Okay, we have one last quick one since we have 6:28 and then I'll wrap up. Joel asks, how do you feel women in the science and arts have progressed or not in standing since the times of Maria Sabia Marian, Rachel Carson, Mary Anning? How do you feel like women have progressed or not in standing, I think is the question.
In science and the arts?
Science and the arts.
Well, tremendously. We're still struggling. Women in STEM, it's an uphill struggle, and some of these very competitive professional fields have more to learn about accommodating how a professional life works for women, where their bodies are on the line if they choose to have children, and their careers may look different than men. So, we're making, I mean, there's a phenomenal progress since the time of my grandmother and great grandmother. They were exceptional women in their time who were able to accomplish a lot despite everything society did to hold them down. And I think we now have exceptional women who continue to do the same. But I would love us to get to a place where it isn't, you don't have to be an exceptional woman, right? You could just be an equal woman and find all the opportunities open to you. I mean, even just in my lifetime, I've seen enormous advantages in how many women are published and represented in the literary world, opportunities for women artists. And I was always valued the work of the Guerrilla Girls. Some of you know their work, who were doing art actions to point out how misogynistic the art world was in terms of the representation of women in exhibitions, et cetera. And, we've caused some good trouble and made some gains. Long way to go. And the same with the issue of science literacy. The backsliding now of taking away reproductive rights from women is going to affect their advance in STEM and the arts profoundly. And we have to work to uphold those freedoms as really making a difference in what a woman can accomplish through having the choice to follow the path that she wishes for herself. So, but as far as I think Marie and Louisa would be amazed at how many women now have meaningful professional lives and somehow manage to juggle both family and profession. But I think they'd be pissed off that we're not farther down the line with that.
Yeah. It's a lot more good trouble to make. Thank you so much, Alison. And thank you, everyone who joined us this evening. We're just about out of time. Alison, it's been great talking. Thank you so much for spending this time. Congratulations again on the book. Succeeding in pulling together these threads of herring and fashion and personal history seems no easy task, and I think you accomplished it incredibly here in this book. So for those of you here, if you're interested in Alison's work, she has a website, AlisonHawthorneDeming.com. You can also check your local independent bookstore or bookshop.org, I think. And I just want to mention one more time, Natural History Institute's website. You can support our work there if you so choose. You can subscribe to our mailing list and be informed of all of these events as they come up. And our YouTube channel is a great resource where this presentation will be available in edited form tomorrow around this time. So with that, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Alison, for your amazing words and insights. I really appreciate it. Thank you for guiding me into science communication. And I appreciate you so much. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Jessie.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye.